Um, well, there's clearly a great deal at stake in this film for you. There's also a great deal of stake in this film for Michael and for Harry. The three of you have an equal stake in this story, and of course there's a fourth person who can't be here, who can't be in the film, which is your mother. Part of what's fascinating about the film and compelling about the film is that it seems to be, as it's progressing, trying to decide what it's about, and that engages the audience in a constant conversation about what's the real story, what is the real point, what is it really about. And Harry, at a certain point, talks about the point of art being the truth, telling the truth, finding the truth. A few minutes later, one of your half-brother, I think, asks you, what's the film about? And then you come up with a few possibilities, but you're still not really sure what it's about. But it seems to me that in the end what the film is about is, for me at least, how it's the struggle to actually figure out what the truth is. That's the real subject, because that's the truth of the film, is the search for the truth.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I feel like what really fascinated me about making this film wasn't the story that happened in my life, which obviously was hugely impactful for me and everybody in my life, but I didn't necessarily think was compelling as an idea for a film. But for me, what was fascinating was this need to know what really happened in the past, and almost more than that, this need we all had to keep telling the story, and the fact that we were all for a year or two before we started making the film telling this story in different ways to people we knew, and that the story was mutating and changing as it got told, and the story was actually changing what the story itself was. It was changing the relationships within the story. So I got really fascinated by the idea of why we are so interested in narrative, and why we need it, and why it's so essential to us to try to make sense of the bewildering nature of our lives.
There definitely comes a point in the film where there are competing narratives, and I think it really comes out into the open with Harry and his desire to publish his version. Do you feel, in a sense, that completing this film is a way of fixing the narrative, of fixing it into a kind of a fixed state?
I kind of hope not, because I think the truth is this story could be told many different ways, and I think they're all legitimate. I've tried to include as many of them as possible in this film, but it certainly isn't the whole picture. My dad doesn't get to tell his entire story. Harry doesn't get to tell his entire story. I never really tell mine, in a way. So my hope is that it's part of the process, and that even the screening process and the way people who see the film will now hopefully, if they're at all interested in the film, go away and talk about it, that the film keeps changing and the story keeps changing. And certainly when I've heard people talk about the film or have read anything that's been written about it, I'm reading about a totally different film than I made. And I think that's kind of the point. Like, for the first time, in my professional life, there's no reason to be at all offended by distortions or variations on what my particular truth is. The point of the film is there are so many of them, and they're all kind of legitimate, even if they're taken out of context.
Why was it that you chose to subtract yourself from the accumulation of different versions I mean, there were a few comments from you, but largely you subtract yourself. Why that decision?
It felt to me like if I'm ultimately the one in the editing room and getting to make all the decisions, and all of the little manipulations that happen in the course of making a documentary, no matter how hard you try, there are manipulations. It felt unfair to then also insert my own version into it to compete with the other versions, because automatically mine would override the others. I think because I'm the filmmaker, I'm going to find a way for you to take my word for it more than the others. So it felt to me like really unjust to give myself an equal voice at times. And I also felt it was less interesting. Like, in a way, I felt like, in a way, my character in the film is the observer and the inquisitor and the one who's curious and the filmmaker. It's not really about me necessarily getting to, figure out how I feel about things.
Well, to kind of take that a step further, most of the sort of orthodoxies of documentary filmmaking are kind of slowly kind of disintegrating in this current era. I mean, I think to a large extent the rule book has been torn up for how to make documentaries. And the possibility that you could have actually been a kind of unreliable narrator inside your own documentary would be a completely valid one. And in a certain way, there is a dimension of unreliable narrator activity in the film, and that's the use of the home movie footage. There comes a point during the film when everyone who's watching it is going to realize that the Super 8 footage that we're seeing, the home movie footage, is fabricated. One question I have is how much of it is fabricated? Is it entirely fabricated? And what do you, why that choice? Why that choice to fabricate an essentially a fictionalized, imagined version of events that actually took place and that you're trying to wrestle with?
I think our intention was to have the audience have a parallel experience with what my experience was, which was, as I, was trying to get more information and trying to understand what the past was and talking to various people, I was constantly in a state of imagining or wondering what was real, what I could rely on, what was fact, what was imbued with nostalgia, what somebody was constructing. And it was just, I could never really find solid ground. And so I think I wanted, as we were, giving the details of this story, for the audience to have a similar experience of just constantly having the question, like, is this real? Is this part of the film? Is this a construction, or is it, an actual document? And in terms of what was real and what wasn't, I don't actually remember the percentage. Maybe you can talk about that a bit more. A lot of it is real footage, and then we did recreations to match it. But what was
I think it's around 30% is actual archival, from what I remember. And just to add to that, I think there are varying degrees of how much we wanted the viewer to question that, because there are some recreations that we did early on, which were meant to be more obvious, I think, which were the rice pudding when you're sitting with your dad at the dining table, and when you're sitting with Harry and having that conversation with him. Those are modern day recreations that we had.
We were tipping our hand with them.
I guess so, yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean, you tip your hand actually very, very early on with a behind-the-scenes shot of you making the film, but nevertheless, unless the audience is really eagle-eyed, for a good portion of the film, they're under the assumption that they're watching original, actual home movie footage. So you kind of you're pulling the carpet out from under the audience in a very conscious, deliberate way, which I guess comes back to the idea of, well, the search for truth and and the truth of the image.
I think what was interesting for us is that it's a huge spectrum on when people discover their recreations. I mean, some people discover it very early. Some people discover it when we show us actually shooting the footage. Some people don't know to the credits, even though we've shown that behind the scenes footage, and don't remember what the hell I'm talking about when I say, but I showed myself filming it. They don't actually remember that sequence. So I think it's interesting, again, like the sort of subjective way in which we watch something. I think people actually do, if they're engaged in the film, get attached to what their version of this film is going to be and be about, and don't want to get caught up maybe in the kind of, construction of the sort of like, postmodern element of it. They just want to be engaged in the story, and I feel like that's kind of great. Like I certainly didn't intend to deceive the audience. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like I have a really visceral reaction when I see films where I feel like I'm intentionally tricked or manipulated. There's a cruelty to it that I don't respond well to. So I didn't want to intentionally sort of deceive people or make them feel things for characters that weren't actually there. We just kind of did our best to match it, thought that people would probably know fairly early on that some were reconstructions and some weren't, but hoped to raise the question of which were which. And I think what happened was, unfortunately, Iris was very rigorous in terms of her choice of camera and film stock, and we were so much testing, and we had an incredible art department, and it just got a lot more accurate than we thought it was going to. So I turned into a jerk.
Well, watching it again the second time, I started, at an early point in the film, I started to think to myself, this whole thing could be made up. I mean, in a way, by doing this, you cast an element of doubt over the entire enterprise. Are these people that she's interviewing actually actors, you know, or are they, or if they're family members, are they willing conspirators in creating one massive fiction? We'll never really know the truth.
Yeah, well, a lot of people, I think a lot of people actually wonder if the people interviewed are actors as well, and I promise they really are my family.
Yeah, we'll take your word for it. Okay, let's get some questions from out there. Yes. Question was about how Sarah said about figuring out when to disclose various bits of information in the film. For instance, we only learn about Diane's first marriage very late in the film. What dictated those choices?
So originally the idea was it was much more of a Rashomon structure where I would tell my version, Harry would tell his version, my dad would tell his version. And there was even like a complicated theater sequence in which these versions would be played on a screen, and the audience, which was comprised of all the people in the film, were going to debate the versions. And I was going to film the debate. And we didn't make it that far, which I think was a good thing. So the idea was we weren't actually going to conceal any information. It was going to be, the story was going to be told to you up front, and then it was about seeing the variations. And then at some point, we decided as an experiment to kind of combine them. And then once we did that, we sort of found my dad's writing as the sort of thread that would be the spine throughout the film. And then there was just, I think a moment where I saw, the card I had on the bulletin board about my mom's, first marriage and divorce, and just moved it to sort of the middle and just thought, like, now what happens? Like, what happens if we approach this more as more of a thriller? Like, what if there's, we hit bottom and then a trapdoor opens, and then we hit bottom again, another trapdoor opens. And I mean, that was very much my experience in a way of, finding this information throughout my life. So again, I was trying to kind of create a parallel experience in a way.
Yes. The question was about the relationship between this film and Away From Her, which also deals with memory and the reliability of memory. And so how active or how conscious was Sarah during the making of that film of this undertaking?
I think that it was, I think it was all very unself-aware and subconscious at that point, and probably until very recently. I haven't known why I've been so obsessed with similar themes around memory and finding the truth in the past and what is real and what isn't, as well as just this kind of obsession with marriage, which, my first two films were all about marriage, and usually to do with, a restless, woman, and a man sort of looking out after her and wondering. And I can't help but think that this story in my life was somehow there, even if I didn't know all the details of it. And I was somehow thinking about that, but it wasn't conscious at all. But when I look back at those films, it's so obvious. I mean, even there are shots in Away From Her that are, a tight shot of Julie Christie and Super 8 staring at the camera. She actually looks quite a bit like my mom, in certain moments. And again, that was completely unconscious. But I think that probably there's a reason when you're involved in a creative process, you keep returning to the same subject matter, why you're doing it, that is somewhat deep-rooted.
Just to follow up on that question, though, the whole question of your paternity is something that you've been living with since you were 18, so nearly 20 years. the whole thing has been percolating or brewing throughout this period. At what point did you feel like you needed to actually kind of make a film?
I think it was probably a year or two after I found out, who my biological father really was, and actually a year probably after I told my father, because I think it was his response to this news and what came out of it for him that for me was most interesting. In a way, like the story itself is, again, it's interesting if you've lived it, but it's actually a story that's been told many times before. But I felt his response and the way he dealt with this news was what was unusual about it and what made me interested in it. And then the fact that he was telling the story and writing it, and so was Harry, and I was looking for a way of talking about it. That dynamic is, I think, what made me interested in making it. So it was about 5 years ago, I guess.
I promise I'm going to come back to you on this, but I want to again follow up on that answer. When you talk about your father's response, what struck me watching it again today was the degree to which, well, I wondered if part of your intention was to try to confront him with his own denial about certain things. The moment where it becomes most apparent is when he clearly doesn't. He clearly is in denial about the fact that Diane knows she's going to die, and everybody else around him is very clear that she was aware that she only had 5 weeks to live, and that seems to be a moment where his propensity perhaps for being in denial about certain things becomes very visible. And so I'm wondering if, in a sense, making the film is, a part of the intention was to bring him out of that.
It wasn't, and it's funny because I don't think there's any way to know if it's denial or not. I mean, on the surface it could look like that, but I have no idea what my mother was telling him or what information doctors actually had or how much people in retrospect decided they knew she was going to die. Everyone might be telling the truth and they might not be. I mean, that's the thing. I feel like I can't accuse my dad of any kind of denial, I don't think, because I don't know what information he was operating with at the time or what the conversations were. I think within my family there is a kind of ruthlessness and a relentlessness about, asking people uncomfortable questions. So I think it probably looks more like a confrontation to normal people than it would within my family, which is just like normal dinner party conversation would be like, you're really upset, aren't you? You're really unhappy about this and you're not talking. I mean, it's like a very confrontational repartee. So I feel like, and it was strange. I say in the film, you told me I had to break you down more, and he actually did say that at one point. Like we had interviewed him for a full day, and I thought, I'm kind of getting the surface of how he presents, and I don't know that he's actually showing anything other than that, and maybe that's fine. But I remember the next day him going, I used to interview people for jobs, and you have to really throw them off if you're going to get anything meaningful or any sense of who they really are, and you're not really throwing me off. And so I was like, okay. So, there was this constant demand on his part for me to, try to go a little bit deeper and get something that he didn't expect to give. So.
Okay, back to the audience. Yes.
My family's response to the finished film has been great. It's been totally bewildering. I don't know why. I feel like for the last 5 years I've been waiting for the sky to fall in and for, total disaster to strike. And oddly, everyone's been really supportive and really enjoyed the experience, I think, of putting it out in the world and getting to have conversations with people. And for me, the greatest part is getting to hear other people's family histories. I feel like maybe for my siblings, they're not finding that as fun. Being stopped on the street in Toronto a lot, being told people's entire family histories. My sister is really resentful of it. She's like, I don't want to hear somebody's boring family history on my way to work again. But I find that the most amazing thing that's come out of it. And I think there's a certain delight for some of them in being recognized. I mean, again, I feel like it was very unconscious, the parallel. When I wrote Take This Waltz, I don't think I was thinking at all about my mother or anybody in my family. I think in retrospect, now having made this film, I look back at that film and say, obviously there's some, parallels, at least in the character of, a woman who's not happy just being settled, not happy just being comfortable and kind of wanting more. So I think that character probably comes out of some sense of my mother, but again, it was very unconscious, and I'm kind of murky on what the connection actually is. But
Well, I guess everyone heard that.
sure. So I can incorporate the question into the answer.
You're
So,
a pro.
The footage of Diane singing Misbehavin', that is a real audition that we found in the archives of the CBC of her auditioning for this part of this host of this TV show. So that was real. And there was actually a lot of footage of her acting, because she had an acting career. But it just felt sort of weird and out of place and montagey or something. Like, it didn't feel like it had real sort of relevance or something. And I felt like who she was better captured actually in other people's words than in her playing other people.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sure. Yeah. I think it was one of my first ideas for the film was that sequence, and I was listening to that song a lot. The scene of the silent montage of everyone responding to the idea of Diane dying. Yeah, so I mean, all of those moments were moments that we took from, parts of the interview where we were talking about her, talking about, her having died, and, everybody, told the story of her death in very vivid detail, which, isn't in the film. But so I would just take moments of silence or when people were having a moment kind of to themselves for that. And yeah, I guess for me, another obvious theme in the film is this idea that when somebody goes who's loved, there's this kind of ripple effect of a kind of shattering that happens of so many people around them. And all of those stories and lives are fundamentally changed and altered and sent in a different direction. And I wanted to just be able to try to create a sequence that captured that. Yeah, I think Iris had the camera on, as soon as we were set up, even before we were set up, the camera was rolling. For the interviews, and continued to roll for the whole day. It's funny, like in a way, the process of doing the recreations was also as messy in a way. It's just, because there's no sound, you don't get a sense. But really, there was a sense where Iris would light to give the maximum freedom to the actors, and then the actors would have a vague idea of what the scene was, and then they would just do it. I mean, it was very kind of undirected, and it was a huge departure for me because I feel like I'm kind of a control freak when I'm making fictional narrative films, and I really like to know where people are going to move and what's going to happen and direct sort of moment by moment, and to just kind of go, okay, like we have a vague set of questions, we're just going to start rolling before this interview, and then with the recreations to just kind of go, okay, do stuff, like improvise everything. See what you mean? Yeah. 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 I think that was a little bit later in the process that I decided to include myself directing my dad. And it's funny, it was a real afterthought. We decided to film him reading that narration, but I think we had questions about whether we would ever use it. And then certainly it was an afterthought to put a camera on me, which I was quite resistant to. That was Anita Lee, our producer's idea, and I was like, this is like such a waste of taxpayers' money to get the second camera, but okay. And so, we had this footage that I couldn't see a use for, but then we definitely discovered a use for, because, again, it felt really false to pretend that this film was anything other than a construction and a manipulation when, again, there's so many stories here that are not fully represented. I think it was important to kind of be constantly aware of the fact that we were constructing a version. So the question was about whether or not, how does it feel to have people apply stuff, from your real life in this film to your fictional films? And you know, it was definitely strange at first when somebody raised it. I didn't think of it myself, to be honest with you. Like, I think, one of the joys of this film is the insights I'm getting from other people that I would not have been able to arrive at on my own. So I remember like reading in a review in Toronto, oh, this was the film she was trying to make with her other 2 films. And originally I was like, screw you, it was not. And then you sort of start to see, you know, that person is pointing to something that you're unaware of, and they're right in a way. I mean, if it's not conscious, it's an unconscious desire to get at something that is so, you know, deep inside you and kind of inaccessible. So, so it's strange, but I have to say it's a lot. It feels a lot more genuine and a lot less uncomfortable than, you know, with Take This Waltz, the millions of questions about, is this about you? Is this about your life? Which I felt was very specific, to be honest, to being, you know, a young woman and an actress making a film, which I just feel like male directors don't always get asked if their films are autobiographical, even though sometimes they really are. So I felt like that I found a lot more frustrating than this, which feels like very insightful and like helpful to me, that people are making those connections and helping me sort of reframe how I'm thinking about it. A lot of people don't get that privilege of, you know, people giving those kinds of insights. So that's been kind of interesting. Well, this film was such a collaboration, I think, more than most. So Iris and I were working on the film together from the very beginning. And for the very kernel of an idea, Iris and I were developing it together. And Mike was, you know, really a co-writer and story editor on the film. And the more I left him alone in the editing room, the more I liked the film. So it really was, I think because it was so close to me, the subject matter, it was really, really important to step back as much as I possibly could and let other creative voices in. So I don't know, I mean, one of the big things that Iris experimented with while we were doing the interviews was to, you know, she all of a sudden had this idea, what if we bring a Super 8 camera and do behind the scenes, you know, of the interviews on Super 8, which seemed like a pretty out there experimental idea to me at the time. But what was interesting was when we watched the footage, we realized like what this does is it makes us realize that even the interview we did yesterday is kind of subjective in terms of our memory of it. Like what actually even just happened, what the moment that's just passed is already up for grabs in terms of what actually happened and who's right and who's wrong and what the truth is. And we realized like that was gonna add a whole other layer to the questions and the conversations that would come out of it. Maybe not consciously, but that there would always be this layer of wondering about what we had just seen. So there were things like that Iris brought to that. Iris had also made a film a few years ago about her family. And a lot of it was a Super 8. It was a short film that was at the Real Asian Festival in Toronto. And I remember that was a really inspiring thing for me going into making this film. So I feel like my collaborators in this film were really co-filmmakers as opposed to just, you know, like a DOP and an editor. Do you have anything to say about?
No, I think the only thing was that you always realized, I mean, to answer, I think your question over here about why we kept the camera rolling on. I think when you work on a documentary, you don't, and especially something like this, you really don't know what it's going to be about. And that was the lovely thing about working on this, was that it was this kernel of an idea that could have taken us anywhere. And so to open up all those possibilities, we had to look at all these other options, such as keeping the camera rolling or having the camera rolling before anything actually begun to reveal maybe the process. And maybe that's useful sometime down the road, and also maybe sometime down the road Super 8 might be interesting. So I mean, and working with the NFB too was also lovely too, because they allowed us that time and really supported us in that experimentation and finding out what this really was about.
Yeah, the National Film Board was a huge collaborator with this film, and this film would not have been made in this form any other way, except with them kind of, you know, they really push filmmakers to think outside of the box. They really push them away from formula. It's kind of the opposite of every other experience you're ever going to have with a financier. But it made us sort of feel like we had to think a little bit beyond what, you know, our initial instincts were, which was really fun.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Iris,
very much.
Sarah, thanks very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.